Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video. Are you looking to amp up your skills in Lightroom or Lightroom Classic? If you are, this is the video for you, as I'm going to share the biggest secret to getting next level in Lightroom. What it is, how it works, why it works, and I'll put it to use on a photo and take you along with me, showing you all the best tricks. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. Okay, so what is this skill that I believe is the key to getting next level to processing in Lightroom? And the one that's the key for all of my processing styles. It's the ability to visualize the impact of light in your image. That is, if there's a light source in or impacting onto your image, how would the elements in the image react to it, or more accurately, reflect that light? Why is this important? Because it's the key to making adjustments to your image that look realistic and adhere to the laws of physics of light, which we all instinctively know, yet we don't know we do. Before we dive into a real image, let's understand the theory of what we're discussing here. Your camera captures light from the scene that's either emitted light from a light source like the sun, or reflected light that bounces off all the surfaces and subjects in your scene. This reflected light has properties that you can manipulate in processing to your advantage. Let's look at 4 examples of interactions between objects and the light. First, flat surfaces will be brighter on the side that's facing the light source. Also, unless the light source is very close, the brightness of this illuminated side will be fairly even. If we look at this cube compared to the sun as our light source, for example, we see that the brightest side has even illumination. For a second type of surface, round or bulging surfaces show the brightest at the part directly facing the light source and closest to it. We also see the opposite side of the light source can be dark, as it has no direct illumination, only light bouncing around the scene from other sources. Note also that illuminated surfaces will take on the hue, that is the color of the light source. An orange sunset will impact an orange color to the objects it illuminates. A third type of lighting is from reflections from a point source, like the setting sun. There are 2 observations here though. One, the farther it travels, the more diffuse it gets. So our senses expect the reflected beam of light to grow more diffuse as it gets farther away from the light source. Secondly, even a beam of light when viewed closer is larger. The same physics apply to standing on a road. It looks wide up close, but becomes smaller the farther it gets, even if it's a constant size throughout. Both of these together makes our perception that a beam of light or reflection should get larger as it gets closer to us and smaller as it falls off farther away. And a 4th example of understanding the physics of light is that the brightness of light is a factor of the distance to the light source, using the inverse square law. That is, the brightness is inversely proportional to the square of the distance. That is 1 over the distance squared. So the brightness goes down to 1/4 at double the distance and 1/16 when you double that distance again. The farther away from the light source, the less bright it will be. Okay, now we understand light and how it behaves on surfaces. Let's get into a photo and how to process it. And here's the plan and the crux of this whole approach and video. We are going to bring out and emphasize the physics and behavior of light in order to add more dynamics and contrast to our photo. And that's the crux of the whole plan. And it's going to work because we're going to rely on people's instinctive knowledge of the physics of light. Okay, the steps for processing our photo. This is a photo of a famous lighthouse near where I live called Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia, Canada. In real life, the scene was amazing. Super dark clouds were just moving off, and the sun that was revealed was trying to light up a scene that was still partly veiled in darkness. I exposed the photo dark to preserve the highlights, so the photo looks a bit gloomy. We're going to liven it up. So first, determine the light source. In this case, it's pretty obvious, the setting sun. If the sun or light source is coming from outside the frame, you need to clearly understand from which side, up, down, below, or above it's coming from. 2, and this is very important and the key to this working, ask yourself the following question. If I were to turn up the intensity of this light, the sun, how would it impact the elements of the scene? It's time to pull out our physics lesson from earlier today. 1. Flat surfaces facing the light source will be brighter and evenly brighter at that. So the side of this lighthouse facing the sun needs to be brighter. 2. All of these rocks that are exposed to the sun need to be brighter but have some fall off, with the outer edges closest to the light source the brightest, and the sides, especially those away from the light source, darker. The same for the clouds in the sky. The sun illuminated edges should be brighter. 3. The overall sky and scene should be brighter closer to the sun, with a fall off as it gets farther away from the sun. And 4th, if the sun was much brighter, this reflection would be more intense. And remember our physics and the example of the road going off into the distance. The farther the reflection from me, the smaller it gets into the distance. And in all of this, the orange setting sun will impart an orange tinge to all the reflective surfaces, making them look warmer on the color balance scale. Okay, here's my image of a famous lighthouse in Nova Scotia, Canada, near where I live, called Peggy's Cove Lighthouse. And we're going to make some adjustments using our knowledge of the physics of light. I underexposed this photo to preserve the highlights, so I'm going to raise the exposure a little bit, as well as maybe raise the shadows a little bit to start us off. The lighthouse is a bit crooked from the distortion from the wide angle lens I was using. We can actually fix that. Under transform, hit guided, make one line here in line with the up and down of the lighthouse, and a second line on the horizon, and voila, we have straightened out our crooked lighthouse. So let's look at how to bring some pop back into the scene by emphasizing the areas that would be lit by a light source, which is the sun in this particular case. Let's start off with the lighthouse here. The side that's facing the sun should be more brightly illuminated. I'm going to hit the masking tool and objects and see whether or not it will just select the side of the lighthouse. Sure enough, it did a very good job. And I will just add some exposure there. Also, as noted earlier, we discussed the fact that the sides facing the sun should be maybe a little bit warmer, because they would be lit by the color of the sun as well. There we go. By the way, if you sign up for my email list, you can download my guide to shooting in backlit situations for free. Link below. Now let's look at the reflection. And the easiest way to do that is with a brush. Now I'm going to show you a trick right here. If you select somewhere on an image with the brush and hit shift and hit another area, you'll create a nice straight line with your brush. But of course, we don't want that in this particular case. We want to emphasize this triangle shape. So I'm going to hit the brush, make it large here at the front end. I'll depress the left button on my mouse, then shift. Then I'm going to change the size of the brush to smaller and hit back here. And look, it made a triangle shape with the brush. I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit and maybe add some color temperature to the right to change the white balance to make it a little bit more golden. Now to apply the inverse square law sense to this image, areas farther away from the light source, which is the sun, should be darker. Now we could do this usually, it's quite common to put a vignette around your image, but that makes it around the center of the image if I show you here. Of course, that's not where the light source is coming from. So instead, we're going to apply a vignette here using a radial gradient. But what I'm going to do is center it around the sun, not around the center of the image. And I'll lower the exposure and invert it. And you can see here, if I press O, it shows you which parts of the radial filter have adjustments applied to it. And I can darken that a little bit and maybe actually move the color temperature slider to the left to make it a little bit more blue. And the inverse of that, in a way, is to add another radial gradient around the sun here. And I can increase the temperature slider to the right, make it warmer, and maybe make it a little bit brighter, increase the shadows a little bit, right there. What I think will really impact this image, though, is working on these rocks that are looking a little bit flat. And what we can do there, of course, we saw on rounded surfaces, the part that's closest to the sun is brightest, and then there's kind of fall off on the sides. We could do that with a brush here if we wanted to, and paint on some exposure. and it would achieve something similar, but we have a tool in here that has fall off kind of built into it, and that is the radial gradients. As you see here, this red dot, you can change the amount of feathering on your radial gradient. So if we take a radial gradient here and put it on the top of one of these rocks and adjust it so that the center is at the part that's facing the sun a little bit more. There we go, and add some exposure and add some warmth by moving the temperature slider to the right. Now, every one of these prominences really should have the same effect. If you right click on a radial gradient, you can duplicate it, and then I can move this around to wherever I want. So I'm going to duplicate these radial gradients and move them around to areas where the rocks would be lit by a brighter light source. And I'll come back in a second when I'm done. And I can cycle these on and off, and you can see the changes that this makes by giving those rocks a little bit more pop. Now this flat rock, on the other hand, is a flat surface like the lighthouse, so it should be lit fairly evenly without a lot of drop off. To do that, we're going to take a brush, and I will paint the top of this rock here, and then apply a little bit of brightness and a little bit of warmth right there, and do so a little bit more evenly because it's a flat surface. A couple other things I like to do. I like to add a linear gradient to big open skies and just darken a little bit from the top, and I like to do the same thing from the bottom. Add a linear gradient from the bottom and just darken the bottom a little bit. It just helps draw your eye a little bit more into the frame. These clouds might also be impacted if there was a little bit more exposure coming from the sun. So we can paint a little bit of exposure on the bottom of these clouds a bit. Maybe emphasizing the areas where they're a little bit brighter already. Not too much though. Just a little bit on the edges here. Also, this piece of broken cloud up top, I really like that. I'd like to emphasize that a little bit more, so I can put a radial gradient on top of that and maybe add some clarity and just get that to pop a little bit more. I like that. I do find that this part of the sky is a little bit maybe almost blown out, so I'm going to apply a radial gradient over that area and hit right click, intersect mask with luminance range, and I'm going to select that area. So what that will do for me is allow me to select the bright parts of the center of that image, and I will lower the highlights there so they don't appear to be blown out as much. I can warm them up a bit as well because that's near the bright orange sun. When I make my adjustments, I like to be a little bit more light-handed. Now it's time to go back and check them out a bit. So let's look at the lighthouse, whether or not that's the right brightness. I can make it a little bit brighter. Same thing with the reflection. Let's check that out. Make it a little bit brighter. The vignette, let's check out to see whether or not that's the right amount, or whether or not we need maybe a little bit more feathering here. Let's just move that around a bit to see what the impact on that is. And on these rocks, I think we can brighten it up a bit, add some warmth as well. And I'm noticing here as well that there are some green grass patches here that maybe need a little bit of treatment. As you can see, they're a little bit brighter on top, darker on the bottom. Just with a little bit of brush here. I'm just going to brush some exposure to the tops of these green patches of grass. Right here. And just bring that out a little bit. Down here as well. Just to add a little bit of color here to what is a very dim scene. And here I'm just making a few more adjustments by hand to fine-tune the image. And finally, some global adjustments. Add some vibrance. We'll see whether or not we can add a little bit of sharpening here. We'll use the masking tool by hitting the Alt key and sliding the masking slider so that sharpening will only be applied to the areas in white. And by hitting the Y key, you get to see the before and after. Now, I'm not trying to tell you how you should process your images, but I'm hoping to show you how the physics of light plays out in a photo compared to people's expectations and how you can manipulate that to bring life and contrast back to your images if they're looking flat and lifeless. Of course, whether or not this is your style of processing is totally up to you. I just want to give you the tools so you know what your options are and you can apply them as you see fit. If all this talk of Lightroom processing has you interested in more, I have a whole playlist on it, which you can see right here. If you thought this video deserving, give it a like and YouTube will show it to even more photographers, helping them with their own Lightroom processing, and I hope that you can use this the next time you come home with photos, allowing you to process them to their best. I know you can do it.